Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Weingarten, are you a medical doctor?
I am not.
Are you a mother?
I am a mother by marriage.
By marriage, I see.
And my wife is here with me, so I'm really glad that she's here, Rabbi Sharon Klein.
Ms. Weingarten, and you haven't taught school since the 90s, so you're not a teacher anymore.
I am actually, Representative, I'm actually on leave from my teaching position, and this fall I will be teaching as a guest teacher at Cornell, my alma mater.
When was the last year you taught? 1997, is that correct?
The last time I taught a full class was June 1997.
Okay, that's been quite a long time, approximately 26 years ago. Do you believe in the First Amendment, Ms. Weingarten?
I believe in the Constitution, including the First Amendment, of course.
Oh, great. Well, I'd like to remind you of one of your tweets here where you agreed that my suspension on Twitter, in your own words, politicians shouldn't be exempt from standards about spreading misinformation. Greene has repeatedly shown reckless disregard for those standards. This suspension is justified. This is your tweet. Just last year, January 2nd, 2022, I was suspended for my statements about COVID-19 as a member of Congress, by the way. And also, I'd like to point out by the emojis by your name here, it looks like you're more of a political activist than anything. Clearly, unfortunately, you think Ukraine comes before the United States. I'm not sure what the black flex is. I mean, is that digital blackface? But congratulations on graduating from school. But I'd like to
No, it is about honoring black
Ms.
educators.
Weingarten, I reclaim my time. I didn't ask you a question.
Sorry.
What I'd like to talk about is your recommendations to the CDC as not a medical doctor, not a biological mother, and really not a teacher either. So what you did is you advised the CDC.
Mr. Chairman, that's attacking
Excuse me,
someone's
this is my time. You advised the CDC to have schools provide remote work, options for staff that have documented high-risk conditions who are increased risk for severe illness from COVID-19 to limit the risk of workplace exposure, telework, virtual teaching opportunities, modified job responsibilities, environmental modifications, scheduling flexibility, temporary reassignments to different job responsibilities. None of your advice had to do with to stop the spread of COVID-19. It was all about teachers staying home. And there was big results of that. Let me tell you, I am a mother, and all three of my children were directly affected by the school closures, by your recommendations, which is something that you really can't understand. I'd like to point out, let's talk about the real effects of this. Obviously, we know the test results. Oh, and by the way, you celebrating what I had said on Twitter, I had said that children should be in school. I had said the truth, that children were not dying at high rates of COVID-19 like older people were. I had also advocated for our children, not for teachers getting to stay home and kids being forced into virtual schooling. I advocated for the safety of our children and for their education. But you, as a political activist, for the president of the teachers union, we're not advocating for anything good for our kids, and our kids have suffered greatly. As a matter of fact, suicides increased. Their rates of learning went down. And you know what else happened to them? Anxiety, depression, all kinds of problems happened to kids. And then ironically, here's something that was shocking to me, and I'll bring this up to you. You know what else happened? While kids were forced to stay home, and you approve of this, the diagnosis of youths with gender dysphoria surged. This is literally 2020, but yet this is 2021. And this is a problem. This is a major problem. And the direct effect of school closures can be seen here. These are diagnoses of gender dysphoria. And you can see it sharply increased after 20 and 21. It went up. The rates went up. So kids were forced to stay home into so-called virtual learning, where they were spending a lot of time on social media, and all of a sudden we see a direct result of this. And this is a major problem. But the other problem is you had no business advising the CDC what the medical guidelines were for school closures, because now we have a nation of school children who have suffered because of it. The problem is people like you need to admit that you're just a political activist, not a
Gentlelady's
teacher,
time is-
not a mother, and not a medical doctor.
Gentlelady's time is
I yield.
expired. Recognize Ms. Maliatakis from New York for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the teachers, the bus drivers, paraprofessionals who have joined us today. Speaking with the teachers, the principals, and the parents in my district, they think it was a grave disservice that schools were closed for as long as they were, in some cases up to 2 years. Your union, as we have found through the committee's investigations, undoubtedly played a role in ensuring that these schools would remain closed far longer than they should have. And we saw indoor dining in bars operating at 50% capacity. The schools were still closed. We saw private schools open. The public schools were still closed. While countries in Europe, such as Sweden and Germany, would reopen their schools just months after the virus pandemic began, it would take almost 2 years, as I said, including in my district, New York City. We now know that in February of 2021, the CDC would allow for the American Federation teachers unprecedented access to help draft guidance and would adopt, in some cases, almost line by line AFT edits, including direct language to install a trigger, which was mentioned earlier, ensuring that schools would remain closed and making it more difficult as possible to resume in-person learning. It's no secret that your union, your local affiliates, spend $20 million on political donations, with nearly all of the funds going to Democrats and liberal groups in the 2021 cycle, as the debate about reopening schools raged. And I think it is a question that we have, is whether you had this type of access because of those contributions. We don't see the parents being asked their opinions, or the private schools being asked their opinions on school reopenings. In fact, I know my principals union also was supporting schools to reopen after a reasonable period of time. But after lobbying for and securing $122 billion in the American Rescue Plan to safely reopen schools, after $60 billion had already been allocated through the CARES Act, the AFT still continued to push for schools to be closed. Private schools opened a year earlier than the public schools did in New York City. You got $190 billion to reopen schools safely, but guess what? As of November, do you know what percentage of that funding was actually used? That $190 billion?
I know, I know that in New York, in September 2020, because as you know quite well, we both are from the same city, that we opened, and the UFT and the principals union and the then mayor did open every single school in 2020. I don't know how much money.
Yes, in the fall
No,
of
in September of 2020, every single school was open.
Yeah, but the triggers were put in place that, you had a couple of cases and the whole entire schools were shut down. But my question is, do you know, you lobbied for the $190 billion in the CARES package. You actually blame Republicans for voting against the American Rescue Plan because you needed that money so badly to reopen the schools. But guess what? Only 15% of that money was spent as of November. So that means you didn't need that money. And Republicans actually have been vindicated in the sense that we were right, all this inflationary spending actually didn't even go to what it was supposed to go to. But I'll say this, the damage has been irreparable to our children, right? And in New York City, which you and I care about very much, 50% are now failing their reading exams. 70% are failing their math exams. 1 in 3 children K through 3 can't read at their grade level. New York is now lowering their test standards as a result. All right, and this is, by the way, a state where we spend more per student than any other state in the country, over $25,000 per student. And we're seeing these horrible results. And I think the school closures had a lot to do with it. Obesity is another problem we're seeing, mental health, the suicide statistics. This tweet, you even acknowledged that remote learning, I could see you squinting, you can't see from
Sorry.
here, but that's all right. And you tweeted out in 2023, what we have seen in public education is that technology can't replace teachers. Remote education didn't work, in part because you have to have relationships, you have to build trust.
Yes.
But yet, your union continued to advocate for these schools to have triggers to close, to keep them closed, unlike private schools. And by the way, some of that money, that 15% that was spent from that $190 billion, it was not spent to reopen schools. It was spent for CRT, for implicit bias, for anti-racism training, for restorative justice programs, especially in cities like ours, in New York City. Are you disappointed that the funding that was meant to reopen schools were spent on programs like that instead?
Well, first off, let me just say that I, over and over again, as Representative Raskin said, wanted schools to reopen and wanted them to reopen safely. And there were monies that were used in terms of that. We needed far more money in terms of testing and monies that were used in terms of that. The guidance was about the presumption in the guidance, both the Cuomo Commission guidance as well as this, because the Cuomo Commission guidance was what governed New York City, and that guidance was about reopening schools. As to the money spent for programs, my understanding is that under the American Rescue Plan, 20% of that money was for programmatic work. And one of the pieces of programmatic work was curriculum, and another piece was how do we help address the emotional and social needs of kids, and that's what the money was used for.
Okay, so you still, to this day, believe it was a good use of money to use that COVID that was supposed to be meant for reopening schools for CRT and other type of training?
Well, Congresswoman, we don't teach CRT in elementary or middle schools.
I now recognize Ms. Dingle from Michigan for 5 minutes of questions.